The gallery smelled faintly of linseed oil and polished wood, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, where voices dropped to whispers as if sound itself feared disturbing the art. Natalie moved lightly through the exhibition hall, her black dress brushing her knees, her curls pinned up loosely in a style that looked careless but deliberate. At 22, she carried herself with both eagerness and defiance, her eyes restless, her smile quick to rise and vanish. She had come only to pass the afternoon, not to find meaning, yet meaning found her. He stood by a painting of a river at dusk, tall, broad-shouldered, hands clasped behind him as though he had been born to carry silence. His hair, flecked with silver, caught the pale glow from the skylight, and his jaw bore the sharpness of a man who had known hunger and triumph in equal measure. He looked like someone who belonged more to novels than to the everyday streets outside. Natalie paused, curious, watching him tilt his head toward the painting. There was something in the stillness of his gaze, in the quiet way he regarded the brushstrokes, that unsettled her. When his eyes shifted and found hers, she felt an odd pull, the kind that turned strangers into mysteries. He smiled faintly, not the rehearsed smile of polite gatherings, but something deeper, as if he had been caught thinking of her already. "You linger by the quiet pieces," he said, his voice low, textured, with the kind of warmth that wrapped around the words before releasing them. Natalie felt heat rise to her face. "Maybe I like what others overlook," she answered, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. His eyes brightened. "Or maybe the quiet pieces like you." It was a line that might have sounded foolish from another man, but in his mouth it carried no pretense, only sincerity. They drifted together as if the paintings had arranged it. Before long, they were walking side by side, commenting on the art but slipping into talk of books, of music, of places they had seen and longed to see. She laughed at something he said, the sound echoing through the gallery, and for a moment Nathan forgot the years between them. He watched her with something like hunger but softer, tempered, as if he were afraid to breathe too deeply and break the spell. Hours later, they stood at the gallery's steps as the sun dipped below the horizon. Natalie felt the strange pang of not wanting to leave. "This was unexpected," she said, adjusting the strap of her bag. Nathan looked at her steadily. "The best things are." That night she came home glowing. Margaret was in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. She looked up from her knitting as Natalie entered. "You're smiling," Margaret said, arching a brow. "Tell me." Natalie leaned against the counter, eyes shining. "I met someone, his name—" "Nathan. He's different, Mama. He listens. He understands things without me having to explain. I can't describe it, but he makes the world feel less heavy." The yarn slipped through Margaret's fingers and rolled across the floor. She bent quickly to retrieve it, hiding the tremor in her hands. Her smile held, but the corners of her lips quivered. "Nathan," she repeated softly, the name pressing against old wounds like salt against an unhealed cut. Natalie, oblivious, nodded eagerly. "Yes, isn't it a lovely name?" Margaret forced a breath, nodding slowly. "Lovely," she whispered, though inside her chest an old door creaked open and shadows stirred. Margaret did not sleep that night. The ceiling fan whirred above, blades cutting the air with a steady, taunting rhythm, but her mind refused peace. She lay rigid on her bed, staring at the cracked plaster on the ceiling, every nerve alive with the sound of that name. Nathan. The syllables dragged her backwards through years she had locked away. She saw herself at 20, standing barefoot in summer grass, Nathan's arm around her waist as they whispered promises into the starlit dark. She heard his voice calling her name with tenderness, felt his lips brushing her temple. And then, as quickly as a candle snuffed, she remembered the morning he was gone. No letter, no reason, only absence. She had waited for months, clinging to hope, until she had no choice but to bury him beneath her willpower and the life she was forced to build. A husband chosen for stability, a child born of duty and eventual love, years of routine stitched together with quiet resilience. And now, decades later, he had returned, through her daughter. Margaret pressed her hands over her face, her heart pounding against her palms. God, why now? Why her? The next morning, she moved like a woman made of glass. Natalie chattered over breakfast, describing Nathan's wit, his smile, his kindness. Margaret stirred her tea with deliberate calm, though her spoon rattled faintly against the cup. He sounds worldly, Margaret said at last, her voice carefully neutral. He is, Natalie replied, dreamy-eyed, but not arrogant. He's seen so much, Mama. He talks about loss as if he knows it, but he doesn't let it make him bitter. He says pain teaches you how to see beauty. Margaret looked away quickly, her throat tightening. That was exactly what Nathan used to say to her, word for word. For the first time in years, Margaret found herself standing at the mirror longer than necessary, staring at the lines time had etched into her face. She pressed her fingers against the wrinkles near her eyes, tracing the years Nathan had missed. That evening, as she folded laundry in silence, her thoughts whispered treacherously. What if he remembers me too? What if the fire never died for him either? She shook her head sharply, biting her lip until she tasted iron. No, she muttered to herself. That door is closed. It has to stay closed. Yet even as she spoke, her chest ached with the fear that it was already opening. The evening air was cool when Nathan arrived at the house. Natalie fussed about the table, arranging flowers into a chipped vase while Margaret stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she stirred the soup. She told herself she was ready, that she would wear her calm like armor, but her chest tightened at every sound of the clock ticking toward his arrival. The doorbell rang. Natalie hurried to open it. Laughter spilled from her lips as she greeted him, her arms looping around his. Nathan stepped inside, tall and steady, carrying the scent of cologne mixed with the faint musk of leather. And then his eyes found Margaret. It was only a second, but the silence that fell seemed to last an eternity. His breath caught, lips parting with recognition, and Margaret felt her stomach twist into knots. The years between them collapsed in that look. Margaret, he said at last, his voice lower than before, tinged with disbelief. Her throat was dry. She forced her lips into a smile, masking the tremor in her chest. Nathan. Natalie blinked, glancing between them. Wait, you two know each other. Nathan recovered first, his smile too smooth, too measured. Your mother and I crossed paths once long ago. Margaret turned away, feigning interest in the soup. She prayed Natalie would not notice how her hands shook. The dinner was a strained theater. Natalie chatted brightly about her work, her friends, her dreams, while Nathan listened, his smile kind, his laughter warm. But whenever his eyes wandered to Margaret, the air between them thickened. She avoided his gaze, yet she felt it burn into her skin all the same. More wine? He asked at one point, his hand brushing hers as he passed the bottle. The contact was brief, accidental, or at least it should have been, but Margaret's pulse leapt, betraying her. She nodded quickly, avoiding his eyes. Later, when Natalie excused herself to fetch dessert, silence filled the room like fog. Nathan leaned closer, his voice low, meant only for Margaret. I didn't know it was you, he whispered. Margaret stiffened. And now that you do, you'll stay away. His expression softened, regret flickering in his eyes. If only it were that simple. Natalie's footsteps returned before Margaret could answer. She pasted her smile back on, though her heart pounded painfully. That night, after Nathan left, Margaret stood at her window, watching the tail lights fade into the distance. Her reflection in the glass looked older, wearier, and and she whispered to herself, "You cannot let this happen again." But deep down, she knew the door had already opened. Margaret tried to keep her distance. She busied herself with chores, lingered longer at church services, avoided being in the same room when Nathan visited. But desire, once stirred, has its own gravity. It was late afternoon when she found him in the garden. The sky was tinged with gold, the roses bending under the weight of the sun. Nathan stood with his hands in his pockets, gazing at the flowers as though they carried old secrets. "You shouldn't be here," Margaret said, her voice firm though her knees felt weak. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "It's just a garden, Margaret." Her jaw tightened. "Don't play games, you know what I mean. My daughter's heart is in your hands, for her sake walk away." Nathan stepped closer, his face drawn but steady. "Do you want me to walk away?" Margaret faltered, her silence louder than any answer. His voice softened, carrying a weight that pressed against her defenses. "You think I haven't tried, but the moment I saw you again, everything I buried came alive. Tell me honestly, have you forgotten me?" Margaret's breath caught. Memories crashed through her, the sound of his laughter under starlight, the way he once held her when she cried, the promises they never fulfilled. She wanted to say yes, to cast him out of her life for good, but her lips betrayed her. "I tried," she whispered, her eyes burning. "I tried every day." The air between them quivered. Nathan reached out, his fingers brushing hers. It was the lightest touch, yet it seared like fire. She should have pulled away, but she stood frozen, trembling beneath the weight of what they both knew. A bird rustled in the branches above, startling her back into herself. She yanked her hand away, turning sharply. "This cannot happen, not again." Nathan's voice followed her retreat. "It already has." She hurried back into the house, her chest heaving. But even as she slammed the door behind her, she knew the truth. She was not running from Nathan. She was running from herself. It was a soft, ordinary evening, the kind of evening that should have passed without consequence. The house was filled with the faint smell of roasted yam and pepper stew. The television murmured in the background as Natalie laughed into her phone, stepping out onto the porch to take a call. Margaret and Nathan remained in the living room. The silence between them was fragile, stretched like glass that could shatter with the slightest sound. Margaret busied herself with the books on the shelf, rearranging them though they needed no rearranging. Nathan sat back on the sofa, his eyes fixed on her with the quiet intensity that had always undone her. "You've grown quiet," he said at last. "I don't see the need for words," she answered, keeping her back to him. Her hands trembled as she slid one book against another. "Margaret," he said softly, and something in the way he spoke her name pulled her around before she could stop herself. Their eyes locked. The years fell away. "Do you hate me?" His voice was hoarse, uncertain, like a man afraid of the answer. She drew in a breath, lips tightening. "I should." His gaze dropped, then lifted again, fierce with longing. "But you don't." Margaret's chest rose and fell. She wanted to deny it, to strike him with words that would end this pull between them, but her throat closed around the truth. He rose from the sofa, moving toward her slowly, as if afraid she would vanish if he stepped too quickly. She backed up against the wall, her palms flat against the wallpaper, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Nathan," she whispered, "stop this, please." But he didn't stop.
What began as one
His hand
stolen
came
kiss
up,
became a chain of
hesitating
betrayals,
for only a moment
each
before
link
brushing
heavier than the
against her
last.
cheek.
It
His
started
touch
with
was
glances
warm,
that lingered too
achingly
long,
familiar.
with hands
Margaret
brushing under the
shivered.
table, with late-night
For one
texts
suspended
written in coded
heartbeat,
words.
they hovered in
Then
the
came
space
meetings,
between right
quick,
and wrong.
urgent, suffocating
Then
in their
his lips
secrecy.
pressed against hers.
They found excuses.
Hungry,
a walk to the
desperate,
store, a
carrying the
drive
ache
to
of
the
years
outskirts of
lost.
town, A visit stretched
Margaret
too long
stiffened,
after Natalie
torn
had gone to
between
bed.
resistance and surrender.
Every moment was a battle
She
between
pushed against
desire
his
and
chest
guilt.
weakly,
Margaret
but her
would sit
body
in church
betrayed
on
her,
Sunday,
leaning
her head
into
bowed,
him,
tears
answering the
sliding
kiss
silently
with the
down her
fire she had
cheeks.
sworn was
She told
long
herself
dead.
she would end it, that she could
The
not keep
sound of
breaking her
footsteps
daughter's
outside
trust.
snapped
Yet
them
the next
apart.
time Nathan
They
touched
stood
her hand,
breathless,
the world
guilty,
dissolved,
as
and
Natalie's
she was 20
laughter
again, young
floated
and
through the
foolish,
open door.
drunk on love.
Margaret's eyes widened
One evening,
in horror.
she stood by the window
She
as
turned from
Nathan
him
parked
quickly,
discreetly
her
at the
hand
corner of the
pressed to her
street.
lips.
She slipped out quietly,
"This is wrong,"
her
she
footsteps
gasped,
light on the
her voice
gravel.
breaking.
He was waiting in the
"God
car,
forgive me,
the engine
this is
off,
wrong."
the cabin dark.
Nathan's
She slid
expression was
inside,
raw,
her breath
his
trembling.
eyes searching hers.
"We shouldn't,"
"It
she
feels like
whispered.
coming home."
"I know," he
Natalie
replied, his
entered,
hand reaching for
still
hers.
smiling from
"But
her
here we
call,
are."
oblivious
His
to the
kiss
storm
found her
she had
again,
nearly
softer
walked
this
into.
time, but filled
Margaret
with the same
forced her
desperate
hands
need.
to steady, forcing
Margaret
a
closed her
smile
eyes,
that did not reach
tears
her
slipping
eyes.
down her face even as she
That
kissed
night,
him
long
back.
after Natalie had gone
At
to
home,
bed,
Natalie
Margaret
glowed
sat
with
in the
happiness,
darkened living
blind to the
room,
betrayal
trembling.
blooming around her.
She touched
She
her
spoke
lips,
of marriage,
still
of
burning
building a
with the
life
memory
with
of his
Nathan.
kiss, and
She
whispered
pressed
into
her
the
dreams
silence,
into words as her
"What have I
mother
done?"
sat silently, nodding, her stomach twisting with every syllable. One night, after a secret meeting, Margaret pulled away from Nathan, her face streaked with tears. "We're destroying her," she whispered. "My own daughter, we are breaking her life apart without her knowing." Nathan pressed his forehead against hers, his voice aching. "I know, but can you let go? Can you look me in the eye and say you don't still love me?" Margaret's silence was the answer. She buried her face in his shoulder, shaking with sobs. When she crept back into the house that night, she found Natalie asleep on the sofa, her head resting against a cushion, her phone slipping from her hand. Margaret stood watching her, a dagger of guilt twisting deeper. She wanted to kneel by her daughter, to confess everything, to beg for forgiveness before it was too late. But she did not. Instead, she tucked a blanket gently over her and walked away, her heart sinking under the weight of the secret that had already begun to poison them all. Natalie had always trusted her mother without question. Margaret was the one who stayed up through her fevers as a child, the one who saved every spare coin to put her through school, the one who said love was sacred, never to be mocked or betrayed. But lately, something in her mother's eyes unsettled her. A flicker of distraction, a nervous tremor in her voice whenever Nathan's name passed her lips. Margaret laughed too quickly when Nathan visited, avoided looking at Natalie when she spoke of wedding plans. At first, Natalie told herself it was nothing. Perhaps her mother only feared losing her little girl to a new life, but the unease grew like a shadow stretching across her days. One afternoon, Natalie stopped by Nathan's office unannounced. She wanted to surprise him with lunch, a small gesture of affection. But when she arrived, she saw him through the glass, standing close to her mother. Too close. Margaret's hand brushed his arm as they spoke in hushed tones, their faces drawn together with a tenderness Natalie recognized all too well. Her stomach dropped. She froze in the hallway, clutching the lunch bag until her fingers ached. Then Margaret's eyes lifted, sharp with panic as they landed on her daughter. "Natalie," Margaret exclaimed, stepping back quickly. Her voice was too bright, too rushed. "I was just checking on Nathan's health. He mentioned headaches last week, and you know me, I still nag about these things." Nathan gave a thin smile, nodding, but his eyes betrayed unease. Natalie forced a smile, though her heart pounded. "That's sweet of you, Mum. You never stop worrying." They spoke a little longer, the air brittle with unspoken truths. Natalie left the office smiling, but her hands shook as she drove away. That night she sat awake in her bed, staring into the darkness. Her mind replayed the scene over and over, the closeness of their bodies, the softness in their voices. It was the look in her mother's eyes that haunted her most. A look Natalie had once thought belonged to her alone, the look of a woman in love. She tried to dismiss it, but suspicion had already seeded itself deep in her chest. And seeds, once planted, will always grow. The following weeks passed in a haze of unease. Natalie became an observer in her own life, watching for every detail that might confirm or deny her fears. She noticed Nathan silencing his phone when she entered the room. She noticed her mother's sudden excuses to leave the house, her unsteady smiles when asked where she had been. It was a Sunday evening when Natalie's doubts twisted into certainty. She had gone to bed early, weary from a long week, but a noise outside her window roused her. She drew back the curtain and saw her mother slipping into a car parked discreetly down the street. Natalie's breath caught. The silhouette in the driver's seat was unmistakable. Nathan. Her hands trembled violently as she dressed quickly, her mind reeling. She followed them in her own car, keeping her headlights dim. They drove out toward the edge of town, down a lonely road where old trees leaned over the tarmac like watchful witnesses. At last, the car pulled into a quiet motel, half hidden by tall hedges. Natalie stopped a little distance away, her chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. She watched as her mother and Nathan stepped out together, their bodies brushing, their faces shadowed with the unmistakable intimacy of lovers. Margaret reached for Nathan's hand. He did not resist. Natalie's vision blurred with tears. She could not move, could not breathe. The truth stood before her, undeniable. The man she loved, the man she had trusted with her future, had been carrying on a secret affair with her own mother. Her mind screamed to confront them, to storm into the motel and tear the truth into the open. But her body betrayed her, frozen to the spot, her heart splintering in silence. She drove home in a daze, the road twisting and curving as if mocking her. When she entered the house, it felt hollow, poisoned by betrayal. She sat on the edge of her bed until dawn, staring at nothing, her body numb but her spirit roaring with grief. When Margaret returned the next morning, moving quietly through the kitchen, Natalie was waiting. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Did you enjoy yourself last night, Mum?" she asked suddenly, her voice sharp with a calm that frightened even her. Margaret froze, the spoon in her hand clattering against the counter. Natalie rose, her body trembling as her voice broke. "How could you, with him of all people, how could you do this to me?" Margaret's face drained of color, her lips parting as though the words had been stolen from her throat. For the first time, the secret was no longer hidden in shadows. It stood between mother and daughter, a living, breathing betrayal that neither could deny. The kitchen was silent, thick with the weight of Natalie's words. Margaret stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, while her daughter's eyes blazed with hurt and fury. "Say something," Natalie demanded, her voice trembling. "Don't just stand there like a coward. Tell me it's not true. Tell me I didn't see you with him." Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. Her silence was answer enough. Natalie let out a bitter laugh, though it was broken and sharp. "So it's true. The man I gave my heart to, the man I thought would be my future, you've been sharing him with me behind my back, my own mother." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks as she reached for her daughter. "Natalie, listen to me." "Don't touch me," Natalie cried, jerking away. "Do you even understand what you've done? You betrayed me, Mum, not a stranger, not some enemy, my own mother." Her voice cracked under the weight of her anguish. Margaret covered her face with her hands, sobbing. "I never meant for it to happen. I tried to fight it. God knows I tried. But Nathan was my first love. He was the man I lost, the man I thought was gone forever. When he came back, it was like the past rushed into the present, And you chose him over me," Natalie cut in, her voice sharp, her eyes burning. "You chose your desire over your daughter's happiness, over everything you taught me about love, about loyalty." The door opened quietly, and Nathan stepped inside, unaware of the storm awaiting him. When he saw the two women, their faces wet with tears and rage, his expression faltered. "Natalie," he began softly, "please." She turned on him, her face contorted with grief. "Don't you dare say my name. You don't deserve to speak it." "Natalie, I never wanted to hurt you," Nathan said, his voice breaking. "But your mother and I, what we had, it never truly ended. We didn't plan this, it just happened," Natalie spat. "That's your excuse. You didn't plan to sleep with my mother while promising me a future." Nathan flinched as though struck. Margaret sobbed harder, her hands pressed to her face. Natalie's chest heaved as she looked between them. "You both disgust me. You've taken everything from me, my trust, my love, my family. There's nothing left." With that, she stormed from the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound reverberated through the house, leaving Margaret and Nathan standing in the ruins of their choices. Days bled into one another, heavy with silence. Natalie barely spoke to her mother, moving through the house like a ghost. Her once bright laughter was gone, replaced by a hollow quiet that seemed to stain every corner of the home. Margaret tried to reach her, but Natalie turned away at every attempt. Sometimes Margaret would stand outside her daughter's bedroom door, her hand resting on the wood, her mouth full of words that never made it past her lips. Nathan tried to call, to explain, but Natalie blocked his number. She couldn't bear to hear his voice again, the voice that had once promised her forever. One evening, Natalie packed a small suitcase. She told her mother in a voice as flat as stone, "I'm leaving. I can't breathe in this house anymore." Margaret's face crumpled. "Natalie, please, don't go, not like this." Natalie met her eyes for the first time in days. Her gaze was raw, wounded. "You killed what we had, Mum. You killed it with your own hands. How can I live under the same roof with the woman who stole the man I loved?" Margaret's knees buckled, and she sank into a chair, sobbing. "I didn't mean to steal him from you. I only wanted to feel alive again." "Then enjoy your life," Natalie said coldly. She lifted her bag and walked toward the door. "But don't expect me to be part of it." The door closed behind her, with a finality that shattered Margaret's heart. Natalie found a small apartment on the far side of town, a place where she could rebuild the pieces of herself. She carried her grief like a scar, invisible yet aching with every memory. She told herself she would heal, though the wound was deep and raw. As for Margaret, she lived in the quiet wreckage of her choice. Nathan visited at times, but the joy they once found in each other was poisoned. Their secret was no longer thrilling, it was a curse. They sat together in silence, two lovers bound by regret. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, Margaret would whisper her daughter's name into the dark, begging for forgiveness that might never come. And Natalie, in her lonely apartment, would stare at the ceiling and whisper to herself, "Never again." Love had brought them together. Betrayal had torn them apart. What remained was only the echo of yesterday, haunting, relentless, and unforgettable.